Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to Kate Kelly on Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast family of podcasts. I'm on with my co-host, Sophie. Hey, Sophie.
Hey, Kelly.
And our third broad today is Kate Kelly, who is the host of a new podcast called Ordinary Equality. Hi, Kate.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So you have very interesting backgrounds. Maybe we could start if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you started thinking and talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, and then we'll talk some about what's going on with that now.
Yeah, so I was raised Mormon, and the Mormon Church was one of the groups that really vociferously fought against the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. So my mother and my grandmother were both assigned by the church to speak out against the Equal Rights Amendment. They lived in Arizona at the time, and Arizona is one of the states that still has not ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. At this point, there are only 12 states that have not ratified, and Arizona is one. So my mother and my grandmother fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, and that's how I learned about it, that it was something that was bad, that it's something that's evil, that it was going to destroy families and our American way of life. And then it wasn't really until I went to law school that I sort of started re-examining constitutional history and why women weren't included in the Constitution and why we weren't fully protected. And then I realized, okay, so my family and my church were a big part of keeping women like me out of the Constitution. And I started then fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment.
All right, so the Equal Rights Amendment is just this teeny tiny little amendment. It's not very many words, but would be super, super exciting if we managed to actually get it into the Constitution.
So the first clause of the Equal Rights Amendment is very simple. It's only 24 words. It's equality of rights shall not be bridged or denied by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And that's the primary clause. There are two others. The second one says that Congress has the power to enforce the Equal Rights Amendment, and the third one gives them sort of a 2-year period for states and the federal government to review their laws and get sexist laws off the books. Pretty simple.
Yeah, and so I don't know exactly how old you are, but certainly this all predated me or Sophie being born. So tell us a little bit about kind of the history, the really brief. Of course, if people want the more involved history, they should listen to your podcast. But a little bit about sort of the brief history of how we got to where we are at this moment right now.
Yeah, so the ERA. Like you said, anyone pretty much born after 1982, when the main fight for the Equal Rights Amendment and the original go-round died, doesn't know about it. And it's not your fault, and it's not my fault. It's because it wasn't really part of the general zeitgeist. There wasn't a big push for it. And so it a whole generation, maybe several generations, don't know about it. But it's really important, and the genesis of it, just in a tiny nutshell, is that it was introduced in Congress in 1923. It was written by a suffragist named Alice Paul. There's an entire episode about her on my podcast, Ordinary Equality, but it was introduced in every Congress until 1972. When the huge women's movement and marches and wave was happening in the 1970s, it pushed it through Congress, got huge support by both parties in Congress, and then it went on to be ratified by the states. So it really quickly was ratified by 30 states right away, a few more states, and eventually it came to the deadline. There was a deadline imposed by Congress. The deadline was 1979. They extended the deadline to 1982, and they still fell 3 states short. So at this point, the Equal Rights Amendment has been around almost 100 years, and we needed those 3 additional states. In 2017, Nevada ratified it. In 2018, Illinois ratified it. And literally just yesterday, in 2020, Virginia finally ratified, becoming the 38th necessary state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment.
So you had mentioned that your mother and grandmother were involved in a fight against the ERA. And I think when most people think about people who had opposed the ERA, they think of Phyllis Schlafly, who was a conservative Catholic writer and columnist. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why religious groups like the Mormon Church and like the Roman Catholic Church opposed the ERA.
Yeah, so it kind of caught really the beginning waves of this culture war. And when conservative groups started sort of really calcifying their boogeyman arguments about why we couldn't do things. So there were a lot of arguments about marriage equality. They said if we get the ERA, we're going to have to let gay people get married. They said that if we get the ERA, we're going to have to let women serve in the military. And at that time, in the 1970s, right around the time of Vietnam, and there was a draft, all of these arguments were very salient. They would say, we're going to drag housewives out of their homes and onto the front lines of the military. They used all these very scary arguments to fight against the Equal Rights Amendment. So a lot of them were also about reproductive choice and about trans issues. And so it's kind of the issues that they still use to this day, although some of them are mute. Obviously, we have marriage equality, so that's moot. Women serve in the military already with great distinction at every level. So a lot of the arguments that they used in the 1970s, the scare tactics that they used, are now completely moot. Really what they focus on today is probably reproductive justice and trans issues. So they try to whip up fear with the bathrooms issue and with different transgender issues.
It seems pretty clear now that this has become a somewhat partisan issue. It took Virginia flipping blue and having a woman Speaker of the House before they finally ratified it. Is that historically true? Was this always a partisan type fight, or is that something that's more recent with everything becoming more partisan?
The Equal Rights Amendment was actually on the platforms of both political parties for decades until 1972. So it was on the Republican platform, the National Republican Party platform, until 1972. And it really wasn't until after many states had already ratified the Equal Rights Amendment that the Republican Party started fighting against it and started using it in this type culture war type arguments that they had. So, in fact, several states that had already ratified the Equal Rights Amendment attempted to rescind their ratifications later in the decade. So they ratified it right away when it passed in 1972. And then by 1979, they decided, oh, wait, our party has reversed their mind on this, and we're going to try to change our minds too. And then they tried to, 5 states attempted to rescind their ratifications. So that tells you how wildly popular it was at the time that it passed, and then it was in this interim decade that they kind of turned the tide.
So we think women should, have rights, but now we don't.
We thought that in 1972, and now we actually changed our minds, and we don't think women should have rights anymore.
So Virginia just became, as you mentioned, the latest state and the last needed state to ratify the ERA. But apparently there's some debate about whether or not the ERA is actually ratified, having to do with the imposed deadline. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the legal arguments surrounding the ERA right now?
Yeah, so like I said, there was a deadline imposed by Congress in the proposing clause of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's not actually in the text of the ratification resolution. It's in the proposing clause, and that makes a legal difference. And that was put on, they put a 7-year deadline. So there actually is nothing about deadlines in Article 5 of the Constitution. There's no schedule. There's no deadline. It doesn't say it has to be done by X time. It basically leaves the process up to Congress. So Congress can put a deadline in. Many amendments had no deadline. For example, the 19th Amendment that granted women the constitutional right to suffrage, there was no deadline on the 19th Amendment. But this amendment did have a deadline imposed, The deadline was 7 years, and it came in 1979. Congress then voted, before it expired, Congress voted in 1978 to extend that deadline to 1982. So the current idea is that Congress put the deadline in, Congress moved the deadline once already, and that Congress can take the deadline out. So there are two bills pending in Congress currently, one in the House, Jackie Speer, who's from California, and then one in the Senate, which is a bipartisan bill. Senator Cardin and Senator Murkowski are sponsoring that deadline removal bill. So those bills, the idea with those bills is that they're going to remove the deadline in Congress, and then they're going to integrate the 3 additional states. That's actually coming up for a vote the week of February 10th in the House. So they'll vote on extending or eliminating that deadline in Congress, and then it will go to the Senate, where many things are sort of backlogged in the Senate right now, as we know, but then it will be, the onus will be on the Senate to pass that deadline elimination bill. Like I said, they're working really hard at this bipartisan strategy. So there are some procedural hurdles to actually fully integrating the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. And like I mentioned, there were 5 states that attempted to rescind their ratification. A case called Idaho versus Freeman went all the way up to the Supreme Court in the 1970s. Can states rescind? The Supreme Court accepted that case, but then when the 1982 deadline lapsed, they dismissed the case as moot. So it's actually not been decided by the Supreme Court. Can a state rescind? Can they rescind their ratification? I think there's a pretty clear legal argument that they cannot rescind. For example, with the 14th Amendment, 2 states attempted to rescind. They voted for it, and then they changed their minds. I guess they didn't like equal protection under the law anymore. And so with those 2 rescissions, they were not counted. They were not acknowledged. And those 2 states, Ohio and New Jersey, were counted among the ratifying states, and it became part of the Constitution. So I think with that precedent, it's pretty clear. Like, once you're ratified, you're on the list, it counts.
So what are some of the sort of practical implications that if this does become an amendment to the Constitution and, then we've got the 2 years to sort of get it up and running, what happens then? What are the some of the practical implications for women and people of all genders in this country?
Yeah, so when you think about an amendment to the Constitution, think about the power of the First Amendment, which gives us many things, one of them freedom of speech. Or think about the Second Amendment, what a strong, almost impenetrable power that has become to protect access to guns in this country. And we can argue about whether or not we believe in that or whether we don't, but what we know is that it has become a very, very robust, powerful thing. That is what the Equal Rights Amendment will become. It is a permanent protection in the U.S. Constitution. It's not subject to the whims of who's ever in Congress, or they can, an executive order can limit it or take it away. Once it's in the Constitution, it's permanent. So there are 2 really practical ways that the Equal Rights Amendment will benefit us. One is that first clause. It will change the level of judicial review. So currently, women get what's called intermediate scrutiny. It's sort of just a confusing legal term, but what it means is that when they review cases that discriminate on the basis of sex, women get a lower standard of review. So it's easier to keep sexist laws on the books. Other categories like race, religion, national origin, alienage, those get what's called strict scrutiny. So it's like the highest level. It's very hard to keep laws on the books that discriminate on the basis of race. So it will raise us, women and all marginalized genders, from that intermediate scrutiny up to that strict scrutiny standard. So it will be easier to litigate those cases. The second part, so that's the part that has to do with litigation. The second part is legislation. So right now, the federal government can only do certain things, and everything else is left up to the states. That's the system they set up when they founded this country. So the things that the federal government can do are very limited. For example, the Violence Against Women Act was passed basically under the guise that it had to do with interstate commerce. Another law that I use as an example is a law that bans female genital mutilation. So there is an anti-FGM law at the federal level, and that law was passed in the 90s. However, a district court judge, a federal judge, just this past year struck down that law. He said it's not that FGM is okay, But the federal government, Congress, does not have the power. It does not have enough to do with interstate commerce. Congress does not have the power to pass a law banning female genital mutilation in our country. And with the Equal Rights Amendment, we would have a totally new anchor. It doesn't have to do with any of these other things. It's to enforce gender equality. So all these new, legislators that would have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, all of these amazing, incredible women who are part of the women's wave, who have new, fresh ideas, they will have a new place in our Constitution from which to pass laws that protect women and girls. And it doesn't have to we don't have to justify it under interstate commerce. We don't have to fit it into anything. We don't have to worry that it's going to be struck down. It's an entirely new platform to build an infrastructure of women's rights.
So now that Virginia has ratified the ERA, sort of what is our next step sort of as activists and as citizens? Should we be contacting Congress about getting rid of the deadline? What is our next step?
Yeah, so I'd say there's two things. One is the federal piece. So the idea is to get the Senate. The most problematic piece in this logjam is, of course, the Senate. So contact your senators, no matter where you live, and tell them that you want them to support the deadline elimination bill in the Senate for the Equal Rights Amendment. So just say no deadline on equality and to support Senate Resolution 6 to eliminate the deadline. And then the second part is actually there are 12 states that still haven't ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And the idea is to keep the momentum going, get these additional states to ratify. So you can go online and figure out which of the states haven't ratified. You can go to myorgisEqualityNow.org/ERA. You can see a map. Spoiler alert, they're all in the South. So all the Southern and the Mormon states. So Utah and Arizona and then all of the South have not ratified. So if you live in any of those states, if you live in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Arkansas, any of those states, and you haven't ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, there are movements in every single one of these states to keep ratifying. So even though we have the 38, the idea is to keep ratifying, get additional states on board. So those are the two things you can do. You can contact your federal senators, and then you can contact your state legislature if you live in those states and tell them you want them to still ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And just be on the right side of history, if nothing else.
So your podcast, I believe, is 12 episodes. So can you tell us a little bit about what all you're covering in that?
Yeah, so the podcast is called Ordinary Equality. It's named after a quote by the person who wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. Her name is Alice Paul. She's a suffragist. And she said there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. She wanted to be very clear that the Equal Rights Amendment is straightforward. So the podcast really goes through my personal journey, but also through the history of the Equal Rights Amendment all the way to the present day and why we need it, what it will do, and what we can do with it in the future. I think a lot of people are focusing on ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course we need it to exist and we need it to be in the Constitution in order for it to protect anyone ever. So that's why people are focusing on ratifying. But I think we also need to focus on what we want it for. What is our platform? What is our agenda? What are we going to do with the Equal Rights Amendment once we get it? And so that's kind of what we're going to explore in the podcast.
Do you have any sense of what the timeline for all of this might look like? Potentially, I suppose we could get the Senate to actually support that joint resolution, and then we'll go forward. But given the current state of the Senate, I don't know how likely that is. Do we have a sense of timeline for all of this?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to keep in mind that it's existed for 100 years. So this has been a very long journey, and everyone has really kept their eyes on the prize. Like Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. It's going to happen. We're not going to give up. It's just a question of when. And we're closer now than we've ever been. We have the 38 states. Like, this is huge. This is gigantic. It's so difficult to change our Constitution. It's the hardest Constitution in the world to change and modify. It's very rare that we change the Constitution. So I don't have a crystal ball. I really wish I did on this particular issue. But, within 2 years, this could happen. We could flip the Senate. We could get this passed. The litigation of the rescissions issues We don't know how that's going to come down. We don't even know if we're actually going to have to decide that in court. So we're very, very close. A lot of ducks have to fall in line. But considering the journey that this amendment has already been on, it seems like a very small blip in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, and I think it's just important. We're just keeping our eyes on the prize. We're saying this is going to happen. We are going to be in the Constitution come hell or high water. And we're just going to keep pushing until we get it.
I'm imagining talking to my kids about this, and, there are several things that just seem so obvious to them. They'll be like, but why do we have an electoral college? And I need to go home and talk to them about this tonight, because it's going to be the same thing. They're going to be like, wait, why? Why is this not already in the Constitution?
I think, and actually the second episode of the podcast, I go back to the constitutional history and examine why women were left out in the first place. Because the part of the Constitution is actually modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a group of Native people in upstate New York, and they had a federalist kind of constitutional system that Benjamin Franklin studied heavily, etc. So the Founding Fathers knew about that system, modeled theirs after it, but in the Iroquois Confederacy, women participate as equals. So essentially they copied and pasted a model and then just stripped out women completely. So it wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a product of the times. It wasn't just like, oh, women didn't participate anywhere. It was a very intentional choice on their part. And I think it's very important to understand that. It's important to understand how Native women influenced this. It's important to understand how women who were enslaved at the time and the entire system of chattel slavery impacted our Constitution. Like you said, the Electoral College and the Three-Fifths Compromise were specific concessions to slave states. So all of this combines to get women in the position we are today, which is in 2020, we're still not fully protected by the Constitution.
Is there anything else that you want to make sure that we talk about?
I don't know. I just feel really optimistic about the future. I'm so excited that more people want to know about the Equal Rights Amendment, as like an Equal Rights Amendment nerd who's been working on this for many years. I'm like, yes, it's actually being covered by the mainstream media. It's actually getting people, today in the elevator, I was wearing an ERA shirt. I'm in Los Angeles right now, and a Southern gentleman in the elevator said, didn't they just pass that in Virginia? It's about damn time. So just a random guy in the elevator cares about the Equal Rights Amendment. I see this as a very good sign.
I love that. I love that you're feeling optimistic about this.
I do feel optimistic, and I think it's the only way to feel. I mean, we have such dire problems in our democracy right now, and the only solutions that are going to solve them are very fundamental changes. We can't change who's on the Supreme Court right now, but what we can do is change the document they're tasked with interpreting. We can take that document out of their hands, put it back in their hands, and have gender equality in it.
I love that, and that is a super hopeful way to end this. So I would encourage everyone to go listen to your podcast for more of a deep dive into this. We've just sort of scratched the surface here on these issues. And Kate, thank you so much for all the work that you do on the Equal Rights Amendment and for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.